Australia has the most land area per capita of any large developed nation in the world. A hugely wealthy and advanced economy boosted by a spectacular wealth in raw materials. All within a liberal democratic system that has fostered both stability and some of the highest average incomes on the planet. But despite all of this, there's a widely acknowledged and growing housing crisis, with property sales records being set so routinely that it's easy to think that incessant property price growth is a law of nature. In this video, we'll take a look at the impacts and causes of the crisis, and dig into some of the lesser considered externalities, that is, the unintended but very real consequences of the Australian housing bubble situation as it stands. Because even though there's plenty of existing commentary on the situation, the crisis is far more catastrophic and wider reaching than the current discussion seems to indicate. Property prices. It's our national obsession, and not without good reason. It's become a market so dynamic that it snowballs with its own momentum, because through the ups and downs of economic trends and financial markets, even through recessions, housing has run consistently hot. The average house price in Sydney went up 146% just in the last decade, and it's not like people were marvelling at how cheap houses were in Sydney in 2012. This has happened because of deliberate policy choices, which have snowballed into a culture that can only be reversed with considerable difficulty now, assuming that Australian society would even want to, which it apparently doesn't. Because, despite what many will contend, the high prices are about much more than raw supply and demand. Sure, a growing population needs more housing. A growing economy means more people have more money to spend on that housing. And interest rates go up and down, encouraging or discouraging people from entering the market at different times. And while it's impossible to determine the exact degree that each factor plays in impacting prices, there's an invisible driver that has spun everything out of control. The Australian tax system. Exciting, I know. And despite being one of the biggest factors that's actually under our control, it's the culprit in the room with blood all over its hands. Particularly important here is the infamous practice of negative gearing, which involves buying an investment property, running its expenses at a loss, and claiming that loss as a deduction against your tax bill. For a country with both high incomes and income tax, that's a juicy carrot indeed. The incentive is so powerful that if you're on a high income and you don't offset your tax liability against an investment property, you're actually losing out to an astonishing degree. Anyone with money knows it. And fair enough, not many people with money like to pay more tax than they absolutely have to. As a result, more than 15% of Australian taxpayers are also landlords. The phenomenon is detailed in an excellent video by Economics Explained, reviewing Australia's economy more broadly. I've included a link in the description. Negative gearing presents wealthier Australians with the choice to either pay tax or use that same money to buy an asset that will keep growing. It's not a difficult choice for the individual, but what about for the collective? This is a waste across the entire society because wealth isn't generated on efforts that bring value, but by raw gamesmanship of a skewed system. Maybe this sounds like the type of situation that almost nobody would support, but of course, almost everybody does. In doing research for this video, I uncovered warning after warning in decades-old Treasury reports and parliamentary inquiries that asserted that if our taxation settings weren't amended, housing would become inaccessible to the general detriment of Australian society. But we never got around to taking it seriously. And now? In Australia, there are more old people than young people, and more rich people than poor people. Around 63% of us own the home we live in, half outright, half with the bank's help. So, while the steep property price acceleration may be locking more and more out of the housing market on the one hand, on the other, incumbent owners feel like they're making money hand over fist. The growth is at such a degree now that any move to ease prices has gone from being hard to prioritise to deeply politically unpalatable. Andrew Barr, the leader of arguably the most progressive government in Australia in the Australian Capital Territory, recently oversaw a 30% annual increase in house prices in the ACT and then actually defended the general inaction on the matter, given that nobody wants the value of their property to go down. And in that, it seems he's right. This was starkly hammered home when the centre-left Australian Labor Party adopted the policy of gradually reversing negative gearing which many believe may have contributed to their losing an unlosable federal election in 2019.
Housing affordability also goes potentially to the policy you took to the last election, negative gearing. And the suggestion is, of course, that post the next election, you might try and deal with this by also dealing with negative gearing. Is it really off the agenda or not?
It's off the agenda, Ross. We've made that really clear. The people expressed a view about that proposal at the last election. You know, housing affordability is obviously a big problem, and we've got to work out the best way we can deal with it.
They dropped the policy, and they won the next election. At the other end of the political spectrum, you might expect the free market rationalists and their ideological stablemates to criticise such a distorted market. But for the most part, they're barely audible. I can only assume that this is because they too have their own portfolios of property. It reminds me very much of Catch-22, where Milo defends the obvious insanity of his egg-buying syndicates, assuring anyone concerned that it's all fine because everyone gets a share. After all, in Australia, 1 in 5 households owns at least one other household. But while many do indeed get a share in the profits gained on paper, in reality, we all share in a society that takes big and increasing losses from this situation. Because housing isn't just an abstract commodity, it's an essential good in that almost everybody wants a place to live. The situation seems clear enough. People with houses win and those without lose, right? Well, sort of. With a bit of digging, it becomes obvious that the list of winners is massively outstripped by the losers here. Say the house you bought for $1 million is now worth $2 million. It sounds like you've made $1 million, right? Well, yes, but also not really. Because you haven't made a cent unless you sell. And because most people need that house to live in, selling means buying another place. So, unless you're moving to an entirely different market, say regional Italy or a fancy caravan, that huge gain is immediately lost just when you make an equivalent purchase. So the real gain for most homeowners is going to be roughly nothing at all. In fact, as those who have done this recently will know, buying and moving into a new house is mostly stressful because mistiming the exchange in the current boom, even by just a few months, can cost you hundreds of thousands of dollars. But even if you get a fair trade, for most people, the biggest impact of the rocketing market is probably just an increased tax bill, given that stamp duty and land taxes are calculated as a percentage of your property's value. And given New South Wales alone reaped some $14 billion from these taxes just last year, we've uncovered yet another strong disincentive for governments to actually enact any policies that might ease prices. So, the list of beneficiaries radically decreases from anyone who already owns a home to the smaller cohort who own multiple homes. But even then, it might not be a trade that even those people would choose. Because every investment dollar put into the dead resource of existing housing is a dollar that could and really should go into generating something of real utility in society. I'll explain. The amount of money that Australians invest into new enterprise in total is less than the government spends subsidising people who invest in property. To be clear, I'm not talking about how much we spend on property, I'm talking about how much the government pays us extra bonus incentive tax deductions to do it. And that has consequences. Skype, Spotify, Minecraft, Candy Crush, endless other tech triumphs have come out of Stockholm, a place with the population of South Australia. From initial investments in the hundreds of thousands, Spotify alone is worth now around $18 billion. Where's our Spotify? We definitely have the talent to be generating and building enterprises like this in Australia, but we take barely any risks in backing our own ideas. Because, frankly, why would you take a risk investing in, say, health innovations or climate technology, when instead you can get paid to invest in a sure bet, like a brick-and-mortar two-better with no installation? But once again, this monopolistic allure means that people are upbidding property prices everywhere, sucking more and more of our money for essentially the same good that contributes almost nothing to the innovation, progress, productivity, or competitive advantages of Australian civilization. In fact, it's doing exactly the opposite. And sinking this extra money into bricks and mortar doesn't just cost us new enterprises. It's potentially costing us, well, anything you like. It's not hard to imagine that the value of Australian properties could be 20% less. After all, in most of the country it was that, just 12 months ago. So if prices had remained stagnant, say, from 2021 to 2022, That's billions of extra dollars that could be flowing elsewhere into our economy. If your imagination needs kickstarting, some 8,500 Danish people banded together to build a wind farm to power Copenhagen and reaped a healthy return in the process. They profited well and generated clean power which could be used to further their society, reduce power prices, and reduce the air pollution where they live. Typically, when 8,500 Australians invest, the social good they generate is some lawyers' conveyancing fees, extra padding for the banks, and, as a casual externality, something like driving single mums out of Newtown. It's fair to say that we're all working harder than we have to be to keep the value of property higher than it needs to be. Even those who reap massive financial rewards are losing from the trade because, contrary to the laziest thinking, we don't live as isolated units where accumulating maximum resources is life's win condition. Humans are a deeply interconnected hive species, and we're all dependent upon all manner of types of people for our well-being. Which is becoming a problem, because as secure housing is less and less affordable to more and more types of people, there are more and more of us who will struggle to fully express our selfhoods, where we're able to do so at all. The idea of expressing a selfhood may sound like esoteric millennial luxury that doesn't exist in the real world, but hear me out. Stay-at-home parents, writers, actors, musicians, social workers, aged carers. These are life paths that are historically low income for most, and they're becoming totally unviable to anyone without family wealth. Okay, maybe you're dumb enough to think that that doesn't matter, but hear me out again. As that price line sweeps up, the unaffordability crisis hits more classes. Nurses, teachers, less profitable small businesses, higher risk entrepreneurial pursuits, etc. As these people are excluded from access to secure lives via secure housing, we all suffer. I, for one, don't want my surgical nurse to be tired from commuting 2 hours a day when they're removing the scissors from my body and sewing me up. I don't want the teacher of my children to be resentful of their life for working hard and still not being able to have a stable place in the suburb that they have to teach in. And I certainly don't want to live in a part of town where someone who loves and is good at baking tasty cakes instead becomes a Subway franchisee because they need the extra financial security just so they can meet something like unnecessarily high housing costs. As it's less and less viable to make a lower income, people will inevitably choose certain types of high social value lives even less, and will be incentivized to instead do well-paid white-collar work that may add very little meaningful value to their own life or even to society's well-being. Say, for example, real estate brokering. Simply because the financial baseline for stability is so high.
The starting point for a first home buyer is to get a good job that pays good money. If you've got a good job and pays good money and you have security in relation to that job, then you can go to the bank and you can borrow money. If housing were unaffordable in Sydney, no one would be buying it.
And for those who don't make that choice? Well, our cities in Australia are so large compared to other countries. The stratification that emerges is increasingly stark, as only people of particular income profiles can congregate in larger and larger areas. There already aren't too many bankers in Punchbowl, and there aren't too many guitar amp repairers in Malvern. This is nothing new, but it's becoming more extreme. This means that people from one class have to go increasingly far to access people of another. We like to think that we don't live in too stratified a society in Australia, so it might sound like an abstract or trivial problem. But the consequences of the degree to which socio-geographic stratifications already are emerging is the diminished capacity for inter-engagement with fellow citizens of different capacities, values and interests. And when you can't access people that aren't like you can't understand them. And when you can't understand them, it's easy to see them as a threat. This type of intangible cost is perhaps one of the most expensive outcomes of the housing crisis, and something I intend to explore in depth in future videos. We also like to think of ourselves as a society where people can choose to do what they want and have a fair go.
A fair go.
A fair go.
Fair go.
Fair go.
Fair dinkum.
Look, I'm going to shirt front Mr. Putin.
But as the cost of secure and stable housing goes up and up, it's fair to mount a case that it's eroding the very quality of our liberal society. The problem is in many ways terminally bad. We're in an environment of insane capture where the political impetus to address the root causes is extremely limited. Negative gearing can't be repealed retroactively, and the collective doesn't want the value of the housing market to collapse. So, what are the other solutions? Well, I'm sure you've been thinking the entire time it's of course reasonable to accept that not everybody needs to own the place they live in. There are similar societies to ours with low rates of home ownership, and this isn't necessarily a big problem in those places. But as you dig deeper, there are a few key differences in the conception and structure of these societies, and they're going to be ones that we're going to need to embrace. Firstly, we'll need to radically overhaul our rental regulations and culture. The average tenancy in Australia is far shorter than in Europe, and it's largely because of the insane growth of property and rental values, which incentivises landlords to keep turning over their tenants so that they can justify rental increases. Secondly, public housing needs to be radically changed. Hong Kong's average dwelling is also very expensive, like Australia's, though the society is able to offer at least a baseline of inclusion by having almost 50% of the population in some form of public housing. The UK and France also house a population in this manner. In Australia, the figure is closer to a shocking 4%, with years-long wait times for housing. Consequently, it's mostly the domain of those enduring particularly severe hardship, and not a cultural norm at all. And alarmingly, the trend appears to be towards less and less public housing in Australia. All in all, I'm optimistic that these trends will be reversed, gradually in some areas, and suddenly in others, as crises require. Because it's clear to me that there isn't a ground for any sort of sustainable and inclusive society with such oddly prohibitive divides. On the other hand, with the current mix of incentives and demographics, I'm very pessimistic that these changes will occur in a timeline that will impact my own life or many others who are in a situation like mine. In short, I think it's going to get worse before it gets better. Which is a loss because many in those lives I detailed earlier will leave, and those who stay will have to change their livelihoods to something that may be a little less rewarding, which doesn't really feel like the dream. But what do you think? I'm keen to hear. Is the way we do housing in Australia better than my assessment? Is it worse? Did I miss anything major? Give me your thoughts in the comments, and if you enjoyed this video, please do like and subscribe, as I'm hoping to do more in the future. I was able to make this video thanks to the support of my patrons. If you'd like me to make more, please do sign up through the links in the video description. Have a great day.